I was torn. Moby Dick, I think, is the greatest work ever written, the greatest novel ever written in English. Um, but the reason I would go with Huck Finn is because Huck Finn's influence on all subsequent literature is incalculable. And not just literature in America. Twain was Borges, but in about half the editions they put the article in front of it, "The Adventures," when it should be "Adventures," and most people refer to it as Huck Finn.
Okay.
It's nickname.
English.
I'll sort of read them the way they would sound, because one of the things about Huck Finn is the language is very oral. It's a book that's intended to sound like it's being spoken. And it employs, and in fact this is one of his great contributions, it employs the vernacular, and it gives it the dignity of high rhetoric, of high literary art. It's something that it took Twain a long time to master this, as you see him working toward the vernacular. And because of that, that's one of the reasons why it's so influential. It's impossible to imagine, as Hemingway said, American literature or even 20th century literature looking the way it does. He said in Green Hills of Africa, he said, all American literature comes out from Huckleberry.
I wanted to do poetry, but it seems to me that prose really does overtake poetry by the time we get to the 19th century. And when is Huckleberry Finn written?
It's published, he started it in 1876, put it away, came back to it in 1879, finished it in 1883. It was published in England in 1884 and came out in America in 1885, so you see all sorts of dates for its publication, but probably 1884. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, but that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth, mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. That is nothing. I never seen anybody but lied, one time or another, without it was Aunt Polly or the widow, or maybe Mary. Aunt Polly, Tom's Aunt Polly she is, and Mary and the widow Douglas is all told about in that book, which is mostly a true book, with some stretchers, as I said before. Now the way that book winds up is this. Tom and me found the money that the robbers hid in the cave, and it made us rich. We got $6,000 apiece, all gold. It was an awful sight of money when it was piled up. Well, Judge Thatcher, he took it and put it out at interest and fetched us $1 a day apiece, all the year round, more than a body could tell what to do with. The widow Douglas, she told me for her son, and allowed she would civilize me. But it was rough living in the house all the time, considering how dismal, regular, and decent the widow was in all her ways. And so when I couldn't stand it no longer, I lit out. I got into my old rags and my sugar hogshead again and was free and satisfied. But Tom Sawyer, he hunted me up, and he said he was going to start a band of robbers, and I might join if I was to go back to the widow and be respectable, so I went back. The widow, she cried over me and called me a poor lost lamb, and she called me a lot of other names too. But she never meant no harm by it. She put me in them new clothes again, and I couldn't do nothing but sweat and feel all cramped up. Well then, the old thing commenced again. The widow rung a bell for supper, and you had to come to time. When you got to the table, you couldn't go right to eating, but you had to wait for the widow to tuck down her head and grumble a little over the victuals, though there weren't nothing really the matter with them. That is, nothing, only everything was cooked up by itself. In a barrel of odds and ends, it is different. Things get mixed up, and the juice kind of swaps around, and things just go better. After supper, she got out her book and learned me about Moses and the bulrushers, and I was in a sweat to find out all about him. But by and by, she let it out that Moses had been dead a considerable long time. So then I didn't care no more about him, because I don't take no stock in dead people. Pretty soon I wanted to smoke and asked the widow to let me, but she wouldn't. She said it was a mean practice and wasn't clean, and I must try not to do it anymore. That is just the way with some people. They get down on a thing when they don't know nothing about it. Here she was, a-bothering about Moses, which was no kin to her, and no use to anybody, being gone, you see, yet finding a power of fault with me for doing a thing that had some good in it. And she took snuff, too. Of course, that was all right, because she done it herself. Her sister, Miss Watson, was a tolerable slim old maid with goggles on, and had just come to live with her, and took a set at me now with a spelling book. She worked me middling hard for about an hour, and then the widow made her ease up. I couldn't stood it much longer. Then for an hour it was deadly dull, and I was fidgety. Miss Watson would say, "Don't put your feet up there, Huckleberry, and don't scrunch up like that, Huckleberry. Sit up straight." And pretty soon she would say, "Don't gap and stretch like that, Huckleberry. Why don't you try to behave?" Then she told me all about the bad place, and I said I wished I was there. She got mad then, but I didn't mean no harm. All I wanted was to go somewheres. All I wanted was a change. I weren't particular. She said it was wicked to say what I said, and she said she wouldn't say it for the whole world. She was going to live so as to go to the good place. Well, I couldn't see no advantage in going where she was going.
I'm going to cut you off right here. As you were reading this, and I don't teach this myself, of course, I've read it. I was wondering, gee, this is very different from a poem where I'm not getting a real impact right in the first line.
Yeah.
Like Arma Wirumque Cano or Mainin Aidith Thea, right at the
I
beginning of
celebrate
Homer.
myself and what I assume you
Maybe we should be doing Whitman, but so I let you read on because it seemed prose is a more subtle thing. And it started to really grab me, and I remember that favorite passage, how Huck likes to mix all his food together to get the flavor to swap it. And by the end of that passage, she seemed to be, I was always wondering what's the difference between Huck's voice and Mark Twain. It seemed like Mark Twain was coming in there on the religious satire. Is there something wrong with the way I'm hearing it, or am I missing something?
With Huck, you have complete naivete. What Huck is he's what we call a socially constructed subject. He picks up the voices of the people around him. Throughout this book, you'll hear...
Is that the strength of Mark Twain? Is that why you picked this?
Voice.
Is that why you picked this book?
Yeah.
And because it's the voices of America?
The voices of... he says in the beginning, and Whitman's better at heteroclasy. He's better at picking up voices and different registers than any poet you're ever going to meet. But because it's poetry, it becomes more monological. It's more Whitman's voice. Twain's the absolute master of the speaking voice. He says in the beginning... And
the story helps carry it, I think.
Oh, yeah. In his explanatory, he says, in this book, a number of dialects are used, and he cites 7 different dialects.
Go ahead, right? Is this Twain's explanation?
This is in the beginning of the book. In this book, a number of dialects are used, to wit, the Missouri Negro dialect, the extremist form of the backwoods Southwestern dialect, the ordinary Pike County dialect, and 4 modified varieties of this last. The shadings have not been done in a haphazard fashion or by guesswork, but painstakingly, and with the trustworthy guidance and support of personal familiarity with these several forms of speech. There's Twain asserting what he always asserts. I know what I'm talking about. I was there.
I think this takes
I
care
speak
of
from expertise. But then you get the Twain joke. Because when Twain is funniest, he's always most serious. I make this explanation for the reason that without it, many readers would suppose that all these characters were trying to talk alike and not succeeding. Before Twain...
But this handles the big question. Should we assign this in the high schools? Because...
No.
You should not.
No. I'll tell you why. This book is accessible, in terms of plot and language, it's accessible to a 9-year-old. It is as adult a book as possible, and to understand it, you have to really understand not only how to read, you have to understand African American slave culture, you have to understand American history. I'll give you an example. Jim, the African American character in this, if you don't know that he's wearing what we call the minstrel mask, and working from behind that mask and manipulating everyone around him, he comes across as a racist stereotype. The people who reacted to this book have reacted accordingly for 2 reasons. One is Jim looks like a ridiculous racist stereotype, when in fact he's a brilliant character who is manipulating everyone around him. And he's so good at it, and Twain understood the minstrel mask so well, he constructed a character who fooled 100 years of critics. And it wasn't until African-American critics read this book and they all said, oh, Jim's wearing the minstrel mask. It was obvious to them, but it hadn't been obvious to hundreds of millions of readers before that. That's how well Twain understood the mask.
Is he talking about that in the explanation?
No, that he doesn't talk about that.
No, but indirectly. Is it?
The other, of course, is the use of what's called the N-word or nigger. He's using it historically accurately. That word, before 1865, was synonymous with slave. After 1865, after emancipation, that word starts to become a slur. In fact, Pap Finn uses it that way. It says, I know you're free, but as far as I'm concerned, you're still a slave. And then it becomes just the most blood-drenched, horrible word in America. That's really not the problem. But it is a problem for signing it in high schools because kids won't understand.
Some people say the structural problem of the book, which is that it winds up with Huck and Jim going down a raft down the Mississippi. And the problem is the journey motif seems to have broken Twain, because if they kept going, they'd be going down to the south and into New Orleans, and they really need to get up the Ohio River, which a raft can't do. Is that still a topic in Twain criticism or
well,
criticism?
The real topic, the real controversy, there were over 2,200 articles and books that I can tell on this, and about 3/4 of them deal with the controversy of the last fifth of the book, what happens on the Phelps plantation when Jim is taken back into slavery and Tom Sawyer shows up. The problem of them going south, as you said, is logistics. A raft can only go one way on the Mississippi, and once they miss Cairo, in America it's pronounced Cairo.
Cairo.
Yeah, it's not pronounced Cairo.
Cairo, Illinois. Cairo, Illinois.
Yeah, they're now completely enslaved. But in a sense, the journey was doomed from the start. There was simply no way Jim was going to be able to get his freedom. And Twain, one of the reasons he did break off is he just, Twain is one of the truly great imaginative geniuses of all time, but composition was not his forte.
Okay, so he's not structuring this.
Twain and structure are in. This isn't Henry James or Marcel Proust.
Okay, so
Twain takes off wherever it goes.
So an argument for not putting him in this series, but we like to break the boundaries.
But I'll tell you, but he's intuitive, because I'll tell you what, the end of the book, which everyone hates. Hemingway, when he said all American literature comes from Huck Finn, he said, but you have to stop after chapter 31, all the rest is cheating.
Okay.
The end of the book is a symbolic representation of Reconstruction. This book is written during the decade of Reconstruction, of post-Reconstruction. Reconstruction in America ends in 1877. This book is written between 1866 and 1883. Twain has already seen that the ex-slaves have been sold out. He's already seen the North turn its back on the freed African Americans. He's seen the rise of primitive groups that will become the Ku Klux Klan, the Night Riders. He's horrified at what's happened. It's a symbolic representation of exactly what the plight of African Americans is in the time he's writing.
Now, he doesn't start out the book, we didn't get a hint of that in these first lines.
No.
Is there a reason?
The opening is really establishing Huck's voice. You don't know about me without you have read a book by the name of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. But that ain't no matter. That book was made by Mr. Mark Twain, and he told the truth, mainly. There was things which he stretched, but mainly he told the truth. That is nothing. I never seen anybody but lied one time or another, without it was Aunt Polly or the widow, or maybe Mary.
Yeah, okay. Is that a nugget of this, or is that, again, a lead-in to the book?
That's just introducing you to Huck's voice. What's typical, we talked about Moby Dick before. Moby Dick starts with one of the most famous sentences in literature. Call me Ishmael.
What does that mean?
It's just, he thinks enough of his authority to look you in the face and say, call me Ishmael. He assumes that you will care about his story.
Who's the guy
This
speaking?
is the beginning of Moby Dick, Ishmael the narrator, the first-person narrator, a man who goes off to sea. Catch the difference between call me Ishmael and you don't know about me without you've read a book by the name. There's a lack of authority, a lack of sense that anyone cares, an alienated, marginalized character.
And he starts introducing other characters.
And he invokes himself through Mark Twain. And then he starts bringing in other characters and trying to get a handle on the world. The importance of what we call the vernacular is not just that it democratized literature, that it brought the voices of common people. Look, Moby Dick is my favorite book. But everyone in Moby Dick speaks in a kind of Shakespearean dialect. Starbuck sounds like Hamlet. It wasn't a concern of Melville's that characters speak the way they do in life. He's still dealing with elevated, literature is elevated. Literature presents language and voice in the most refined way. The voice of Huck Finn, the voice of Mark Twain, represents the way people actually speak. And it's tied to the way they look at things. Let me give you an example. If you tell me something I don't know, and I say to you, That is a fact that hitherto I had not considered. As opposed to, gee, I didn't know that. Why would a person say the first instead of the second? Well, the first shows you that I'm a literate person, I'm a man of education. I can, as my father would say, toss the language around pretty good. But it throws a lot of words at you that simply say, gee, I didn't know. Twain knew all the $25 words. This was a man who was fully fluent in 3 languages. He probably knew Shakespeare and Elizabethan literature better than anyone in America. His books are all intertextual with Shakespeare.
Intertextual meaning what?
Meaning that they're constantly alluding to Shakespeare, drawing on him. Huck's famous speech, the most famous chapter probably in American literature, chapter 31, where he's debating whether to send Jim back into slavery or not, and he's debating with himself, is taken from Claudius's speech in Hamlet, where he says, "You can't pray a lie. I found that out." I mean, it's a vernacularizing of that. He adored Shakespeare. I mean, he just absolutely loved it. As did Mel. Twain's language, the vernacular is a functional language. It's plebeian in origin. It's concerned with process and how things are done. It's not concerned with impressing you with the speaker's learning. It's very tied to practical tasks and the physical world. And I'll tell you what Twain did. Dickens had done this, but Dickens's characters are somewhat puppet-like. Well, yeah, and Dickens is a great artist, but there is a kind of mechanical puppet-like externality to his characters. What Twain did was he got you inside the consciousness of those characters. This whole book is all about Huck's consciousness. He's not citing them from the outside the way you would puppets on a stage. You're inside Huck Finn's mind. You see how that mind works. Huck Finn is barely literate, but he's extremely intelligent, as is Jen.
Is this some kind of metaphor for American culture?
Yeah. I mean, Twain comes along at a time, right after a time where people were saying, who reads an American book? You know, what is American literature? I mean, it was constantly coming over from Europe. Before Hawthorne, Melville, Poe, Emerson, Whitman, Dickinson, before we call this the American Renaissance. There never was a nascence, but we call it because everything is patterned after the Renaissance. And before that, some of my colleagues in Colonial will scream at me for this, but American literature was a pretty paltry thing. It really wasn't anything special. And Mark Twain is arguably the single most influential figure. What Twain did is, the Puritans used to constantly scrutinize themselves and others for signs of possible saving grace. What you see in America, and it starts with Emerson and Whitman, and Twain is a continuation of that, is a scrutinizing of the world we live in. Not for signs of saving grace, but to understand the world we live in. Mark Twain, you'll like this. Mark Twain is, when you're on a steamboat, you're constantly have poles in the waters to see if you're going to run adrift. So it's quarter Twain, 7 seconds, 10 past half Twain. All of these are lengths, so the bottom of the boat doesn't hit the ground. Mark Twain is the depth at which your boat's about to hit the ground.
I went drifting through the capitals of tin, where men can't walk or freely talk, and sons turn their fathers in. I stopped outside a church house where the citizens like to sit.